grateful to be here with you. I don't want to share under pretense. I have a spiritual gift. It's curing insomniacs, so if you fall asleep, just feel like you fell under the power of my gift. And also, I want you to know that while I have many books that are out there, most of them are bought by anesthesiologists because they've found that they have a greater capacity to keep people held under deep sleep longer than the drugs that they use, and they can do it for a lot cheaper. I've been asked to address the topic C.S. Lewis and the Case Against Scientism, and I have to begin with some confessions. My first confession is the title for the lecture is not original. I drew the title from Michael Ashleman's The Restitution of Man, C.S. Lewis and the Case Against Scientism. And any observed similarity to that book will be primarily due to our both drawing inspiration from C.S. Lewis as a common source. And furthermore, I was asked to draw on Lewis for this lecture. My master's thesis and Ph.D. dissertations were both written about Lewis themes, and most of my academic specialization has been focused on Lewis. Most of my books have been written about him. I've studied his work seriously for 48 years. I have been lecturing college and university courses for 38, and I've lectured on him now at 34 universities in 17 different countries. I do not say this to validate what I'm going to say, but rather to lend credence to this fact that I feel I am only scratching the surface of Lewis' studies and what can be known about him and the books that influenced him. Many years ago, I met for breakfast with a plumber. He was a bright guy, had a university education in English literature, went into a family plumbing business. He had calluses on his hands and calluses on his brain because he continued to read after he graduated from university. In the morning, he drew on a piece of napkin, not a cloth napkin, but a paper napkin, 3 concentric circles. And he said, I think our acquisition of knowledge is like these 3 concentric circles. If we look in at what we've acquired, we run the risk of becoming arrogant the more we know. But the way to keep growing is always look out from the growing perimeter, which reveals in greater and greater proportion how much there is out there that we're absolutely clueless about. And anyone who has spent a lifetime studying a particular author or idea or school of thought knows exactly what I'm talking about. We are people fundamentally pea-brains. The Widener Library at Harvard University has 19 million volumes under that one roof. Who's read them all? The Bodleian Library at Oxford University has 136 miles of shelf space. They pride themselves that if you put in a reader's ticket, they could have the book for you in 24 hours. We don't know very much. Second confession, I am not a scientist. Though my undergraduate degree is in the sciences, what is now called applied health science, it was once called kinesiology, but when I was in school was given the more humble name of PE major or physical education. And so consequently, I would like to say to you, I'm a poster child for the liberal arts. C.S. Lewis opens more than wardrobe doors. I'm probably the only PE major in the world who's actually read Dante, who's actually read Milton, who's actually read Spencer's The Faerie Queene, who's actually read these books. Lewis opens more than wardrobe doors. I've been studying him voraciously, but I am not a scientist. Every time I have a student in class who's studying applied health science or chemistry, I say, tell me the Krebs cycle. I still remember it from college. Do you know it? And they say, oh, I took it last semester, but I've forgotten. So I rag on them all the time. Till one student brought his textbook that had the opaque pages and the transparent pages, and I said, what's that? And he says, it gives the phases of the Krebs cycle. I go, how many phases are in the Krebs cycle? This guy said, 86. I said, oh. When I was in college, it only had 4. That's why I remember it. So I not only have a little bit of a science background, but not much. Even what I have is a total irrelevancy. Suffice it here to confess that my formal studies, I only brushed up against the sciences as a moth brushes its wings against a lighted window. My third confession, C.S. Lewis, the Oxford Don and later Cambridge professor, was also not a scientist. Certainly he had respect for the sciences. He remained all of his life an amateur astronomer. And he wrote knowledgeably about the history of science, most particularly about the medieval cosmology in his book, The Discarded Image. Nevertheless, he was not a person who focused his academic life on the material sciences. So with those confessions, nevertheless, I do think Lewis has something to say to the scientific community, and those who extend an invitation for me to address you this morning must have thought so as well. And so C.S. Lewis in the case against scientism. While Lewis had respect for the sciences per se, he spoke out against what he called scientism, that is, what he would call the religion of science. In order to keep matters clear, it must be added that Lewis was a theistic evolutionist, and he held this view because he thought it was a conclusion indicated by honest scientific theological study. I myself am not a theistic evolutionist. I'm an actual six-day guy. Lewis once described himself as a dinosaur. I think I'm probably more of a dinosaur. There aren't very many people who hold my view, but nevertheless, I can read what other people think and try and be challenged by their thoughts. I have no problem with this. But nevertheless, Lewis wrote against what he called scientism, or naturalism, and materialism in several of his books and essays, both his fiction and his nonfiction. In his nonfiction, works such as The Abolition of Man and Miracles would be examples, as well as his fiction and his science fiction trilogy. Even three of his Narnian books, The Magician's Nephew, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and The Silver Chair, come immediately to mind. And there are numerous essays where he speaks of these things, particularly De Futilitate, of futility, his inaugural address for the endowed professorship of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University, titled De Descriptione Temporum, a description of the times, and most notably his funeral of the great myth, and the great myth that he's eulogizing is scientism, the religion of science. And the funeral of the great myth, in this particular essay, and I'm going to borrow from it as I share my remarks, this essay begins by noting how each generation tends to depreciate the one immediately preceding it. I had an opportunity to cultivate a bit of an acquaintance with Mortimer Adler, the philosopher at University of Chicago, who was the last editor-in-chief of the Encyclopedia Britannica, put together the great books of the Western world, wrote some 60 books. And I was talking to him one time, and he was talking about philosophical mistakes that were made, and he started talking about the Enlightenment philosophers as being ignorant men. I said, how could you call them ignorant men? How could you call Descartes and Locke and these people ignorant? And he says, oh, I'm not saying they were unintelligent. He said, but I don't think they had read literature more than 2 generations before they're showing up on the scene. He said, if they had have read the Theaetetus by Plato, Locke wouldn't have made the mistakes he made. And so generally what happens is one generation will depreciate the generations that preceded them. And also, I would have to say, we have a blindness, Lewis says, of the errors in our own era. We can point out the errors of those who preceded us, but we can't fast forward and look back and see where we've gone off the rails in our own time. And even in the midst of this, we still pass on some of the perennial philosophy to the generation that's following us. There has been a thread of good thought that's come down to us, and hopefully, because we are availing ourselves of books, we could read beyond our own time. And he says one of the best ways to check the excesses of your own time is to read old books, and then with that have a standard by which you can judge the thinking of your own era. Consequently, when Lewis seeks to eulogize the great myth of scientism, he has in mind this idea of evolutionism. And like scientism, it is for Lewis more like a religion and pseudoscience than anything Lewis would regard as true science. Nevertheless, Lewis does believe that many have been sucked into the vortex of this religion, especially those elements of it embedded in materialism and naturalism. And by these, Lewis would have in mind some basic ontological assumptions that should rest at the heart of any worldview. In Miracles, Lewis notes that the basic ontological question, for those of you ontology, ontos is the Greek participle, comes from the Greek verb eimi, I am. Ontos means being. Ontology is the study of being and existence. And the basic ontological question is that in a world flush with contingencies, there must be something that is eternal that transcends those contingencies. Lewis writes this, "It is clear that there never was a time when nothing existed, otherwise nothing would exist now. And here Lewis has let his bucket down into the deep well of philosophy and drawn from books like Plato's Timaeus, where Plato said, now everything that becomes or is created must of necessity be created by some cause, for without a cause, nothing can be created at all. Now, Lewis underscores three possible ontological assumptions. Each of these assumptions has a boatload of possibilities under the umbrella of each one. But let's just look at the generalizations. First, things just happen. Nobody takes that view very seriously. Carl Sagan, who was a brilliant astrophysicist when he did his series called Cosmo, he would talk about the intricacy and the balance of the universe, and he'd say, and the amazing thing is it just happened. I don't know how Carl Sagan got away with it. I didn't get away with that kind of explanation when I was a child. If I would have marked with crayons on the wall and then discarded the crayons and played with the next toy, and my mother would have come in and seen the markings on the wall, if she would have given me the benefit of the doubt and asked, how did that get up there? If I would have said to her, I don't know, Mom, I think it just happened, I would have been spanked twice, once for marking on the wall and once for not telling the truth about it. Nothing just happens. No, Rembrandt didn't put an easel up on a canvas on an easel and there was a Rembrandt painting for you. No baby gives birth to itself, no building builds itself. People don't take this particular view very seriously. The two they take most seriously is that matter is eternal. It's always been. Matter of fact, most of us drank the Kool-Aid when we were in middle school because our teacher told us this phrase, you finish it, matter is neither created nor, yeah, you all heard it in junior high. It's a materialist presupposition that's not proved. And consequently, because of that, we just bought it, probably our teachers bought it without thinking. But matter is neither created nor destroyed. Matter's always been. And so we explain the ontological phenomenon. It's always been there and it's been reconfigured by various means and so on. But if that's true, Lewis, who when he was an atheist bought that worldview, Lewis eventually moved away because he saw the incongruities in the worldview. Many materialists don't see the incongruities, and so Lewis feels he has to spell this out, probably spelled it out best in his book, Miracles. What are the incongruities? Well, you ask the materialists, okay, I can understand why you might think rocks have always been here, but how did we move from rocks to thought? How do we move from rocks to things like concerns for justice or issues of love and so on? And the materialist has an answer. The materialist says, oh, the lovers don't love each other. The man saw the woman. Her image was projected on the retina of his eye through a series of electrical synapses that travel along the optic nerve, stimulated the brain, caused the secretion of particular hormones. He called it love, but it's not love. It's just chemistry. It's all matter. And Lewis bought that. And then he said, but as he thought about it, he said that he thought the materialist, though, expected you to believe his explanation. But if his explanation was true, he just looked at the lovers. They projected an image on his eye through a series of electrical synapses that travel along his optic nerve, stimulated his brain, caused the secretion of particular hormones, and he said explanation. He wanted you to believe his explanation was valid while he was discounting the explanation of the lovers. And consequently, Lewis says that's incongruous. And he says, I cannot believe reason is mere cerebral biochemistry. Lewis believes there's something biochemical going on. And while that may explain some, it can't explain all of the phenomenon. And if there's data left out, then the explanation needs to be reconfigured. And Lewis comes to the place where basically he embraces a supernaturalist approach to the universe. He said, I am fundamentally a supernaturalist. Doesn't mean that there are things that have natural sequence and process going on, but what is their origin and where do they come from? Remember when you were a kid and you took dominoes and you strung them on the coffee table in the living room? And after you'd strung them up, hopefully you got to push the first one over before your little brother or sister did. If your brother or sister pushed the first one over, it caused a new string of contingencies. You slugged your brother or sister, right? But no, you push the first one over. Something outside the dominoes has to exist to set them up. Something outside the dominoes has to exist in order to start the process. Lewis's own pilgrimage to faith required that he somehow climb over these particular barriers of materialism in his days of atheism. And furthermore, the myth that Lewis eulogizes draws on his many years processing these things. And if you want the cliff notes of his process, read Miracles by C.S. Lewis. Lewis also draws on his incredible breadth of reading to make an observation that would require such breadth. Often most interpretive judgments are made after some discovery occurs. The developmental theorists tell us all development begins with a moment of disequilibrium, where we see our present conceptual framework is not sufficient enough to account for the data coming in. Change is necessary. But what kind of change? If we don't change, then our development is truncated, and we stay stifled in our growth. What kind of change is necessary? Is it change of kind? Do we throw out the old conceptual framework and begin anew? Or is it a change of degree? We add the new data to a growing, more robust understanding. A tree doesn't have to give up its interior rings just because it adds more. But if it's not adding more rings, it's dead. But the myth, as Lewis thinks of it, this myth of scientism and materialism, as he thinks of it, drove the myth, as he thinks of it, drove the discoveries. People found what they were looking for. And Lewis says that every generation basically gets the science that it wants. What were the materialistic assumptions that caused them to find what they were looking for? Professor Basil Mitchell, he was my doctoral supervisor. He was at Oxford University, Oriel College, Oxford. He wrote a book called Faith and Criticism. He said the person of faith needs the critic, but the critic also needs the person of faith. The person of faith needs a critic, lest they painted thus saith the Lord across their own opinions. Lewis said the worst of bad men are religious bad men. Quicker I'm willing to die for my faith, maybe the quicker I'd be willing to kill for my faith. Or painted thus saith the Lord across my own opinions, and I start using the Bible like a ventriloquist uses his dummy. On the other hand, if I don't have the criticism that'll break me out of and give me a growing sense of conceptual framework, the critic needs to realize, because he or she doesn't know everything, the critic also has a faith position, and the critic needs the person of faith to speak them. That dialogue has to go on. And Mitchell says we're very unlikely to be neutral in the process, but Mitchell believes we can be impartial. How do we work towards impartiality? And this kind of impartiality is going to be very important lest we begin to project our own impressions on the data as it comes to us. And how do we become impartial? Well, it works something like this. If my wife Claudia says this to me, and I hear this, we're going to talk like this. We're going to miss each other completely. Mitchell says you have to give the other party veto power over your impressions. So Claudia and I talk like this. 2 or 3 days later, I say to her, hey, Claudia, do you remember when you said this to me? She said, I never said that to you. I said, Claudia, I was in the room. I heard you. Now it's a matter of integrity. No, I didn't hear her. I heard what I thought she said. I interpreted it through my grid. I have to give her veto power over my understanding. And I say, Claudia, is this what you meant? And she says, heavens no, I didn't mean that at all. I said, well, I don't always get it right. She says, yeah, we've established that in this marriage frequently. I said, well, give it to me again slowly. And she gives it to me again, and I'm here, and I say, is this what you meant? She says, no. I say, please, one more time, be patient with me. She gives it to me again, we're on the same page. Now, maybe we're on the same page and we agree. Or maybe we're going to move, but if we're going to move with helpful data that moves us because we've established a common ground in our thinking. Well, I'm not having a dialogue with reality, but I'm being impartial about reality because I'm letting reality itself speak in a way that will cause me to modify the data that I'm receiving as I begin to adjust my conceptual framework. The Inkling, a fellow Inkling with C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, his name was Charles Williams, he wrote, not one mind in 1,000 can be trusted to state accurately what its opponent says, much less what he thinks. And John Locke made this observation, whatsoever credit or authority we give to any propositions more than it receives from the principles and proofs it supports itself on is owing to our inclination that way. And Lewis is basically asking these materialists and naturalists to look at the inclinations that they're bringing to their study of nature and so on. In Lewis's reading of the seminal literature of the West, he noted that this mythological idealism long preceded what many of the mid-19th century and early 20th century world were thinking in relation to science. Some found what they were looking for. And Lewis again noted, every age gets the science it wants. The corrective for Lewis is to keep focused on reality. Lewis was an objectivist. He believed there was an objective world that existed independent of my thoughts. And he also believed that there are knowers, subjects. Truth is not reality for Lewis. Truth is what I think about reality when I think accurately about it. And that reality, that which is assumed by a false statement, there's no reality to support the claim. I keep inclining towards reality, and I can find the corrective there. The difference between truth, the classical definition of truth, a statement is true when it says what is, or what is not, and a statement is false when it says what is not, or what is not is. This is a pin. I could argue about how I define the term, but once I come up with a definition that's accepted by a culture, I can talk about it without one of these being here. So this is a pin, that's a true statement because I said what is. This is not an elephant, that's a false statement because I said what is not is. Or excuse me, this is not an elephant because I said what is not is not. If I said this is an elephant, there's no reality to support the claim. And this becomes very important. And for Lewis, I need to dig hard to try to understand that reality. That's classic definition. Throughout history, we've come up with anomalies of defining truth, but they haven't lasted very long because they're unresponsive to the way the world really is. By contrast, or not by contrast, if I develop a little bit further, opinion for Lewis is based on probability. If I don't have probability for it, it's just mere prejudice. Opinion is based on probability rather than certainty, therefore it's subject to doubt, and reasonable people could differ in matters of opinion. And I want to be narrow in matters of truth, open in matters of opinion, and wise enough to know the difference. I don't know about you guys, but I'm out talking to people about faith fairly frequently, and I'll see people and they'll say, I don't want anything to do with Jesus' statement where he says he's the only way to God. John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And I say, why do you have trouble with that? It's so narrow. And I say, wow. We need to go back to square one before we assess whether or not that statement is false by virtue of its narrowness. You see, all true statements are narrow. That you can have a sure word about things. That doesn't mean we've solved all the problems. Every truth I know I can plumb more deeply. I can see applications I never considered before. So I hold the sure words with an open hand of humility. But nevertheless, all true statements are narrow. Jesus' statement may or may not be true. I believe it is fully true, and I believe it's demonstrably true. But nevertheless, it may or may not be true. But the statement that it's narrow does not make it false. All true statements are by nature narrow. Lewis understands this. Matter of fact, he even says about reality, I shouldn't be threatened by it. Seems to me the Christian scientist should be, Christian science informed by the love of God, should be the most objective there is. Because if I know God loves me, I don't have to think my security rests in whether or not I've got this right. I can begin to assume as a fallen and finite person, often I'll get it wrong. God loves me. My sense of self-worth is based on his love. Let's look at the reality. And the biggest idea in all of Lewis's writings is helpful in this case against scientism. The biggest idea, I can go to every one of his 73 books and show you where Lewis is talking about this or where Lewis says it explicitly. Here's the biggest idea. Reality is iconoclastic. Reality is iconoclastic. An iconoclast is a person who breaks an idol. So I have an image of God. I go to a lecture. I read a book. I have a late night conversation with a friend. I hear a sermon someplace. Well, that image that comes after that new data comes in, some of the pieces of the puzzle come together for me, and that image is helpful. But if I hold too tightly to that present understanding, it will compete against my having a growing understanding. My own insecurity may cause me to hold on to it too tightly. It keeps me from having this growing understanding. And as Lewis says, God is always kicking out the walls of temples we build for him because he wants to give us more of himself. Now, he even says, I want God, not my idea of God. I want my neighbor, not my idea of my neighbor. I want myself, not my idea of myself. It's not a new idea with Lewis. If you read Lewis, again, he opens more than wardrobe doors. He's going to take you to other books as well. And as you read those books, you'll find that many people held this position. You could read Baron von Hugel, an author who influenced Lewis, the philosopher of religion in England. And Baron von Hugel, in his letters to his niece on spiritual development, says to her, beware of the first clarity. Press on to the second clarity and the third clarity. Let the idea that you're trafficking in right now take your breath away, not only now, but as you go deeper in that idea and see its wider application, beware of the first clarity. Press on to the second clarity. Robert Browning, in his poem, Rabbi Ben Ezra. Any of you who are married, write down the title of this poem. Any of you who hope to get married, write down the title of this poem. I read it to my wife every year on our anniversary. It's the one that begins, grow old along with me, the best is yet to be. But about line 30 of that poem, Browning says, then welcome each rebuff that turns earth's smoothness rough. We can think we have it all figured out, but the earth isn't smooth. It has texture, it has peaks, it has valleys. Welcome the thing that helps you to see it the way that it is rather than the way you have to have it be. And if you know that you're loved by God and your identity is wrapped up in that love, you can invite these kinds of things to come in and consider them. Another one is Tennyson in his poem In Memoriam. He says of theological systems, our little systems have their day. They have their day and cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee, and thou, O Lord, art more than they. Theologian Walter Elwell used to always say, all theology is approximation. And what we do is we seek better and better approximations. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis says theology is a map. It gives us the contours and it can show us our direction, but the map itself is not the geography. This is helpful to us. Augustine in the Confessions said something similar. He said at the beginning of the Confessions, the house of my soul is too small. Enlarge it, Lord, that you might enter in. Or Stephen in Acts chapter 7, he's accused of speaking against the temple. And in his defense, he says, are you kidding me? This is root translation now. Are you kidding me? You think you've got God in that box up on the hill up there? Don't you know when God first appeared to Abraham, our forefather, it was in Mesopotamia, hundreds and hundreds of miles from where that box is. And when Joseph went down to Egypt, he didn't go by himself. God was with him. And when Moses was taking care of his father-in-law's sheep in the wilderness of Midian, God showed up to him there in a burning bush. And when David wanted to build the box, God said, David, I appreciate the sentiment, but frankly, heaven is my throne. Earth is just a little footstool. How will you build a box there that can contain me? God is really big. And then how does Lewis put it in the Narnian Chronicles? When Lucy, the most spiritually sensitive person from our world to go into Narnia, she sees Aslan, the Christ figure, the lion of that world, for the first time in her second visit, and she exclaims, Aslan, you're bigger. He says, oh no, child, I am not. But every year you grow, you'll find me bigger. And if I'm in any kind of theological or even scientific construct that's causing me not to grow because of my own insecurities, to have it be that way, something's goofy. Change follows on the heels of disequilibrium. Change is necessary. I have to discern, is it a change of kind or is it a change of degree? In fact, Lewis believed most scientists do operate in the realm of objectivity. He believed this. He had great respect for the sciences. He writes, to the biologist, evolution is a hypothesis. It covers more of the facts than any other hypothesis at present on the market and is therefore to be accepted unless or until some new supposal can be shown to cover still more facts with fewer assumptions. At least that is what I think most biologists would say, Lewis writes. The view is held with the humility of an open hand, because it's our understanding that's adjusting to the data as it's coming in. Lewis writes, in science, evolution is a theory about changes. In the myth, scientism, it is a fact about improvements. And this gets kind of sketchy for Lewis, this idea of improvements, as if we know where things are going. Lewis says that true science makes no cosmic statements, no metaphysical statements, no eschatological statements. But the myth knows none of these reticences. It's already developing its own teleology self-referentially and projecting it. Nevertheless, Lewis sees not all scientists stick to the proper course, for immediately after noting the objectivity of most scientists, he recognizes some who seem to be driven by different agenda. He cites a Professor D.M.S. Watson, who said of evolution, evolution is accepted by zoologists not because it has been observed to be true, but because the only alternative, special creation, is clearly incredible. Here Lewis rightly observes, in cases such as this, the sole ground for believing is not empirical but metaphysical. The dogma of an amateur metaphysician who finds special creation incredible. That's not the sign of a growing mind. That's a sign of a person who's already had a proclivity that caused them to come to a particular conclusion and discount anything that might count against it. Lewis says, in the myth, however, there is nothing hypothetical about it. It is basic fact. That is, it presents itself as a last word ending all debate. Lewis in The Discarded Image talks about the issue of Galileo with the church at the time he was talking about a heliocentric cosmology. Kepler didn't get the flack that Galileo got. And Lewis is writing about this. And Lewis and his set read the trial transcripts. He said nobody would have been upset about Galileo being heliocentric. There were some people who were obnoxious in the church. I'm not trying to discount that. But he said throughout history, nobody could quite configure or come up with a mathematical configurement with the movement of the planets. The Greek word for planetes, is, it means wanderer. How do we account for that mathematically? And they were always reconfiguring their theories. Why was Galileo considered so obnoxious? And Lewis said because Galileo thought he had the last word on it, nothing else would be considered. And consequently, Lewis said it was his theory of theories that anybody could come up with a last word on anything. And in fact, in Galileo's own day, there was a change that had to be made because Galileo thought the planets went around the Earth, the sun in a circle, whereas Kepler comes on the scene and says, no, it's an ellipsis. That wasn't quite right. And so Lewis said that the trial was against Galileo for his theory of theories, his belief that he could have a last word, a final word, and there was nothing more to be said. And when I say a last word, I don't mean you can't have a final court of appeal to reality, to scripture, or whatever. But when I say a last word in the way I'm talking about it, a last word is if I've got it all figured out. I can still plumb the truth more deeply. I can still see applications beyond my present applications. When this trickles down in popular culture, that we can have a last word and the science gives us that last word, science is cited as a kind of absolute. Some people say, and all too often it is uttered in popular culture, well, science says, or as the scientists have affirmed. These statements, coming when they do, seem to imply that science supplies an absolutely settled matter ending all debate. In these cases, there is almost a kind of ignorance of the writings of people like Thomas Kuhn and his structure of scientific revolutions. He says the paradigms of science have always had to give way with more robust understanding as more data comes in. And sometimes it's been a change of kind. Sometimes it's been a change of degree. I'll give you a case in point. I was giving a C.S. Lewis course at Wheaton College, and I had a student in the class. Her name was Farrell Shannon. She's a bright, bright young woman. And she came and said to me that her best friend from kindergarten was a student at Brown University, so she's an Ivy Leaguer. She's going to be coming to Wheaton on her spring break, which was different than ours, and was going to spend a week with Farrell, and she would be coming to class, and Farrell said to me, she is an atheist and a materialist, and when she comes to class, would I be willing to talk with her about spiritual things? I said, Farrell, I'd be delighted to. They come to class. After class, they come up, and I say, Farrell says you guys have been friends since kindergarten. That's interesting to me. Not many people have friendships that last that long. Tell me about that. I said, she said, you go to Brown University? You're an Ivy Leaguer? That's interesting. You're a bright person. What are you studying there? She says, I'm studying biochemistry. I said, wow, that's even more impressive. You're studying a very challenging major. Tell me about that. And I said, okay, we talked about spiritual things in class. What did you think? She says, well, frankly, as a biochemist, and I thought that was a little premature. She was only a sophomore. As a biochemist, I live by the principle that if I can't perceive it empirically, I just don't believe it. I said, let me see if I've got that right. You live by the principle that if you can't perceive it empirically, you just don't believe it. She says, that's right. I said, well, would you please then set forth that principle for me empirically? As soon as I said it, she saw the incongruity. She freaked out. She said, I never saw the contradiction in my own presupposition before in my life. She said, I can't believe this. Everybody at Brown University believes this. I said, no, there's Christians at Brown University too. They get everywhere. You'd be surprised. I said, plus, I've talked to materialists. Being fair to materialists, I've talked to materialists who wouldn't press that particular point. And I said, now, don't get me wrong. I really like the sciences. But you've got somebody like John Polkinghorne, who was a physicist at Cambridge University, had a degree in physics, had a degree in theology, pastored a church while he was a president of one of the Cambridge University colleges. He said, if you ask the scientist, why is the kettle boiling? The scientist would say to you rightly, heat from the burner is agitating the molecules and causing the kettle to boil at 100 degrees centigrade at sea level. He said that's the quantifiable, measurable features that answers that question. But he said it could also be answered this way. Why is the kettle boiling? I wanted a cup of tea, and would you like one too? And frankly, the scientist, by mere scientific investigation, could never give you the second answer. It doesn't mean that the scientist's answer is not significant. It is significant for what it's capable of doing. But we have to be careful we don't try to make it do more than it could do. So Mortimer Adler, the philosopher, said in 4 generations we've gone from saying that which is measurable is that which is significant for science to saying that which is measurable is the only thing that's significant. And we've lost. Humanity dies in that process. I mentioned to this young woman also, you're in a university. If it's a liberal arts university, you've got 4 divisions: fine arts, sciences, social sciences, and humanities. And we believe each of these has a place at the table. And it makes a discussion a robust discussion for human flourishing. So the scientist has much to say about that which is measurable. I love the sciences. I love what the engineers have done with the sciences as they apply what they've learned. My life is better. I live in Chicago. You guys are cold in the winter here too. I think we might be colder in Chicago. I'm glad that I don't have to go out to an outhouse. We've got hydraulics. We've got people who have applied these things. Engineering, what the scientists have discovered, my life, the quality of my life is better. Maybe not. Maybe I'd be more robust if I had to live this hard life, but I appreciate, anyway, the comforts that are brought to me from science and engineering. I said, I like the social sciences. I like demography. I like to see the writings of the people, demos, people, graphe, writing, to see what the opinions are of the people, to understand my culture and my context. But cultures are fluid, and I can't extract from that any kind of absolute, cultural absolute, transcendent, objective morality from that. But I can get some good understanding of where people are at. Maybe there are some things I can draw from that, from the demography. I said, I love the fine arts, as Tolkien says. They reveal that man is made in the image of a creator. We don't just do things intuitively. Sure, it's true. Bees build hives. Birds build nests. Beavers build dams. But you never saw anything like the Gregorian period of Beaver Dam. You never saw anything like the Romanesque period of Robinesque. Or we could say, oh yeah, we can see right here, these bees must have lived in this era because we can see the Georgian architecture in this particular beehive. No, we don't just build out of some sort of intuitive need. We decorate what we build with things that are not necessary because we're made in the image of a creator and we have this creative impulse. I want to hear what the fine arts say so I can understand what it means to be human better, and the humanities. Now this is my area, so let me make a case. I have not read all the writings of the last 3,000 years, but I've read samplings across a 3,000 year period. And I can tell you about the things that flare up in a moment, like 4th of July fireworks, and die out into darkness, and we never hear about those things again. But I can also tell you about the things that seem to percolate to the surface generation after generation after generation. And these are very deep human questions, concerns of the human heart. If I'm engaged in ministry, it's good for me to know that. My students, when they come to my class now, I'm an old guy. I say to my students in my class, I don't know the names of the bands you listen to. I don't know the names of their drummers. I don't know the lyrics of their music. And you don't know the names of the bands I listen to or their drummers or their lyrics. I say we're people who occupy the same planet, but we come from different cultures. How are we going to connect? I said, but I have read across this long spectrum. And I do know the things that percolate from generation to generation. And I think we can meet at those human places. I also tell them, I've got all these books I traffic in and read and reread. I got the books in my area of academic study that I have to keep up on. And I've got this pile of books over here that I long to read but just don't have time. As soon as I retire, I'm jumping into the deep end of that pool. And every new book I read is going to reveal to me something I didn't know before that might have counted against what I taught my students. I said, I'm going to constantly be praying for you that God's going to be there pushing the delete button where it was necessary. I'm doing the best I know how, but we all have these limitations. And consequently, Lewis notes that having first turned what was a theory of change into a theory of improvements, it then makes scientism a cosmic theory, as if I can know where history is going necessarily. You want to read a great essay on it, read his essay, Historicism in Christian Reflections. Not merely terrestrial organisms, but everything is moving upwards and onwards in a particular direction they imagine. Reason is evolved out of instinct, virtue out of complexes, poetry out of erotic howls and grunts, civilization out of savagery, he writes, the organic out of the inorganic, the solar system out of some sidereal soup. And conversely, Lewis writes, reason, virtue, art, and civilization as we know them are only part of the crude or embryonic beginnings of far better things, perhaps even deity itself in the remote future. It inflates what it means to be human. It doesn't understand. The humility dies. Estimations of what is known or can be known are inflated. The judgments that follow on the heels of these false notions become dismissive of other points of view. Opposition is silence, and the prevailing myth persists almost unquestioned in that atmosphere. In the public sphere, you can hear echoes of it in a comment like, he's on the wrong side of history. No debate, no hermeneutical suspicion, just the judgment that seems to suggest someone in a finite moment can say something universal about where history has been or where it's going. As Lewis suggested, the myth that existed before scientism persists in drawing the myth for judgments about the future. Man becomes a god. You want to read a book where he talks about this specifically? Read The Abolition of Man. He talks about the fact that the people in this green book, he's deconstructing a green book. It's a book on grammar for sixth form. That would be the equivalent of 11th and 12th grade students in America. He said they had embedded assumptions in this book. And the embedded assumptions were that reality had nothing to do with the pursuit of truth. So if you sever the subjective understanding from its object that gives clarity, then all of a sudden you're left with just subjectivism. And subjectivism becomes basically a place that houses this sort of scientism. And also it becomes self-referential and generally drifts towards being utilitarian. Lewis adds, the myth does not end here. It has a final assertion to make. In the myths of old, Lewis said, the gods and heroes all die. Siegfried dies. Arthur dies, Roland dies, and now these people say, quoting Lewis, the sun will cool, all suns will cool, the whole universe will run down. Life, every form of life will be banished without hope of return from every cubic inch of infinite space. Lewis says it all ends like an Elizabethan tragedy. The universe burns out, all is despair, all is hopeless. There is in the end no meaning, no purpose, no teleos. And you start to get this eschatological projection, self-referentially projected. But Lewis, the supernaturalist, says no. Lewis resists scientism and the despair of materialism. He embraces fully the more robust supernaturalism that can account for meaning and purpose. Creation implies intention. The potter throwing clay on the wheel has in mind already what he or she wants to do with that clay. Make a picture, make a vase. And so too, as Dante in the De Monarchia made the observation, function precedes essence. God had a purpose before he made anything with the essence to fulfill the purpose. He recounts the fact that when God created, on the first day of creation, what do we get? Light. But he doesn't create the luminaries, the sun, moon, and stars that will emit light till day 4. Function preceded the creation of the essences. Light before luminaries. People matter. In fact, as Lewis said, there are no mere mortals. We are entrusted with the eternal weight of glory and purpose of helping and nurturing those around us to live their lives according to the flourishing that we see modeled in the image of Christ. This cultivates a sense of value, of purpose, and duty, as well as humility, wonder, gratitude, and worship. I would like to move towards a conclusion by talking about this idea in the Lewisian understanding of the study, say, of sciences, or ourselves, or the world we live in. And what I think one of his finest things that he writes, it's chapter 17 of the last book he wrote for publication, called Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. I'm going to recite for you a paragraph in that and then make application of it. But before I recite the paragraph, I need to define a word that's embedded in this paragraph. I don't define it to insult your intelligence. You probably already know the word. I had no clue what this word meant when I first read this. So if you're here like I was then, I define it for you. It's the word coruscation. Coruscation. Coruscation means a sudden flash of brightness. We could talk about fireflies coruscating in the back garden on a humid summer evening. Or we could look westward as we see dark clouds coming our direction, and we could talk about lightning coruscating in the clouds. Okay, with that in mind, here's what Lewis says. Making a comparison between gratitude, hearts full of gratefulness, and adoration, hearts full of worship. Gratitude exclaims very properly, "How good of God to give me this." But adoration asks, what must that being be like whose far off and momentary coruscations are like this? One's mind runs back up the sunbeam to the sun. Wow. I remember reading that. It was right about the time Voyager, the interplanetary probe, was speeding past Saturn about 1979, 1980. And they discovered, with the pictures up close and personal of that great mysterious planet, the planet with rings, that the outer ring of Saturn, they call it the F ring, it's braided. It's braided. There's no warbling in the other rings. It's interesting. One of my best friends is a physicist. I say to him, "Why is it braided?" He said, "Jerry, these are the questions that keep us physicists up late into the night." I've read 5 different explanations. Each explanation is a negation of the other 4. I think one day a physicist will tell us why it's braided. I mentioned it to a firefighting friend of mine, and he said, "Yeah, Jerry, and we don't know if God didn't just braid it for the picture." And I think, wow, what must God be like? Though no human eye had ever seen it, he chose to braid the outer ring of Saturn. I think of fish in the bowels of the ocean. Some ship parks itself over the Pacific Ocean and dangles cameras into the depths of that water where there's no light of the sun reaching, and they take pictures of fish painted neon bright. Why are they painted neon bright? Can't be to attract to mates, not for camouflage. There's no sight. Matter of fact, how do fish get together at those depths? That's interesting in its own right. And I think to myself, what must God be like that he painted fish neon bright in the bowels of the ocean? I grew up in Southern California. I always liked to see palm trees silhouetted against an auburn sunset sky, or a mountain range silhouetted against an auburn sunset sky. Now I live in the Midwest. A cornfield silhouetted against an auburn sunset sky. There's beauty there if you would willingly distill it out. But we could have lived on a darkened planet and gotten word from on high that there would be one sunset. And we could have lined every west coast of every continent and every island on our globe and regaled our progeny with the glory of that great event by writing about it in our journals and diaries. But what must God be like that he's made our planet a perpetual kaleidoscope of sunrises and sunsets? The wonder still stays there as I look at the world that he's created. As a scientist, the wonder awakens in me, and I know who to be grateful for and who to worship as I begin to discover these things. We could look at one star twinkling in a night sky, and that should be enough to awaken wonder and awe in the mind and heart of every right-thinking, right-feeling individual. But what must God be like that he has glittered the night sky with stars and moons and shooting stars and galaxies? And I was up by Lake Superior, and I remember with a bunch of students, all of a sudden at midnight, the northern lights came out. And we saw reds and blues and greens and whites pulsating and coruscating in the night sky. And we did the only thing that seemed just, rendered to God his due, and worshiped him on the ski dock and sang songs of praise and prayed to him all that time. But Lewis won't let us stop there. He forces us to ask other hard questions too. What must God be like? That there are earthquakes in Haiti, tsunamis in Japan, AIDS babies born in Africa, that women throughout history have been abused, that minorities have from time immemorial been marginalized by majority cultures, and that there are school shootings in America. Lewis forces us to look at that reality too. He's an honest scholar. He looks at the things that might count against his position. And Lewis writes in Mere Christianity, if our religion is objective, then we must never avert our eyes from those elements in it which seem puzzling or repellent, for it is precisely in the puzzling and repellent that we begin to discover what we do not yet know and need to know. The materialist can cry out against the injustices of the world, but he does so without a transcendent, objective, moral foundation. Furthermore, in the religion of Scientism that denies the supernatural, one's eyes are blinded to the transcendent as a source of grace and hope. In fact, this is what Lewis himself discovered in his own pilgrimage to faith. He knew firsthand the deep longings of his heart, and he quested for the proper object of those longings. He went through what he called the dialectic of desire, tethering that desire to one object, finding it couldn't fulfill. It was one of the things that moth and rust destroy, thieves break in and steal. He untethered, tethered again, untethered, tethered again. And finally he writes in Mere Christianity, if I find in my heart a desire that nothing in this earth can satisfy, then it doesn't mean the world's a crock or a fraud. Maybe the world was meant to awaken the desire, but in fact, it sends me on a quest to find the object that transcends this world, who is the object of my deepest fulfillment. And Lewis saw this was the big problem with scientism. Scientism, not science, but the religion of science that distracts me in a materialistic worldview from the one who gives real meaning and purpose to life. So that's it.